you got much more out of talking to other people and going to clubs and societies and the Labour Club and so on, and Marxist clubs. Was this when you became a Marxist, or?
No, no. I was Marxist, or I thought of myself as a communist, from the age of, from 1932. I was converted in 1932 when I declared I was a communist in my German school, and a schoolmaster whose name I sometimes can still remember, but I mean I remember nothing else about him, asked me some questions and then said, "You clearly have no idea what you're talking about. Go to the school library and look up something," and I discovered the Communist Manifesto. That's what converted me both to Marxism and history.
Interesting. Well, it's such a large subject, I don't quite know how to approach it. But presumably at Cambridge you became a member of the party, did you? Or?
Yes.
I suppose the one question is, when you said that you were converted to both Marxism and history, and I remember Keith Thomas saying that basically the problem being a historian at Balliol with Christopher Hill was that if you didn't have a Marxist framework, you really didn't have any framework at all, which I thought surprising from him in a way. But basically, otherwise it's just chronological. Is that what you found in Marxism, a sort of an answer to the question of explanation and origins and why things...
Certainly. Oh, certainly. I mean, well, there were really two things. One is essentially, you might say, the evolutionary approach. Where do human beings come from in societies? How do they change until they get to where we are today? Which still seems to me to be, I won't say it's the only kind of history, because anybody who writes according to certain rules about the past can say that he's writing history. But there is no way of understanding history without asking this question also. The other, which at that time preoccupied me much more, at least when I got to England, was the relationship between what Marx would have called base and superstructure, namely culture, and what is it in a particular society which explains the particular shape of or formation of cultural events. How does this relate to the rest? I rejected the usual Central European things, zeitgeist and stuff like that. But basically that was the one historic question that I first posed to myself. But I quite agree with you. It was the fact that I couldn't think of anything else which offered a equally fertile, if you like, heuristically and to some extent intellectually fertile framework. And that's not only because it tied up with history, but it tied up with all manner of other things. I mean, I grew up believing that Marxism, as it were, was something which covers everything, you see. It's not where the history theory can be isolated either from natural science on one hand or from other disciplines or other areas of interest in the other. But that doesn't mean that I actually pursued this as a systematic I've never pursued a systematic project in history. And this is a curious situation. Almost all the things that I've done in history have been, as it were, occasioned from outside, one way or another. And the thing that's given them unity isn't that I set out to, like saying, I am going to write the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, like Gibbon, but that behind it there was a coherent picture of historical change and historical development, which is what I got from Marxism. And still.
When you say these projects came from outside, do you mean there was some accident, like you went to a seminar, or your publisher said, or...
Yeah. Almost, I think, without exception.
Well, let's take two of your famous examples. Let's take the social banditry aspect. Yes. I mean, how did that emerge accidentally?
It emerged accidentally because I was going around mostly Italy and Spain at the time and being curious about this, that and the other and interested. And then the anthropologists in Cambridge and Manchester were interested at the time in various problems, apropos largely of Mau Mau. And Max Gluckman, I think, asked me at some time, he says, we're thinking about whether there's anything like Mau Mau in early European history. Could you come and talk to a seminar? So I looked around and thought of it and gave him a seminar. And then he said, why don't you come and give us some lectures at this in Manchester and do a colloquium? And various people there doing this kind of stuff. Norman Cohn was there, and others. So I gave a few lectures, and then he said, if I give you, get Manchester University Press to give you a contract, would you make it into a book? And that's how it happened. I mean, certainly all my books, and none of them, all of them came about this, and even my choice of research subjects. I mean, my original research subject would have been the agrarian problem in North Africa, because I got a travel grant in '38 for that, and was absolutely fascinated by it. Well, during the war, I mean, I couldn't do anything very much because I was called up in February 1940, so there wasn't really very much I could do before then. In the course of the war, I got married to somebody that I didn't at that time think I would want to leave to go after the war to spend some time in Algeria or something like this. So I had to look for something else. So I looked around desperately for something that could be done, or if need be, that could be prepared before the war ended. And I hit upon the Fabian Society, where incidentally my old schoolmaster proved useful enough because he had all these Toynbee Hall and other connections. So I did that a bit. And then I discovered, in fact, eventually I discovered it was no good, it wasn't interesting enough. But in the course of doing this, I'd been hunting around the LSE and discovered the web collection. And the web collection, which is actually saying about how trade unions actually worked at that time. They knew more about it than anybody else. And it was marvellous because Industrial Democracy, which is the book they wrote about it, is, in my view, the best book ever written about British trade unions. Huh? And I discovered, right, that's the angle of labour history I want to take. Not the societies, not the official, the history of events, but the history of these structures at the bottom. So I did that and developed along that line. Then, the other books, almost invariably, I mean, the 19th century trilogy was a straightforward, George Weidenfeld thought he might risk it. It was just past the worst period of the Cold War. And so I did that, and it worked out, the first volume worked out quite well. It was mostly based on what I was lecturing on, so, it was easy enough.
You were at Birkbeck, right?
Yeah, I was at Birkbeck throughout.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I had 5 years in Cambridge too, but I couldn't get a job there, so I gave a few lectures there, but I mean, I couldn't get a job in Cambridge. I had some job difficulties. And then, again, in most cases, it's people come and say, why don't you write a book on this?
What about for example, the invention of tradition? I know that was...
No, that was an idea of my own, but I then organised a conference for past and present, or we discussed it and organised this conference, and then after that they said, well, why don't Terry and you get together and because originally, I mean, I'd got a few of these odd ideas, but I wouldn't normally have done, have set about specifically doing it. I mean, I wouldn't mind stimulating other people to do it too, which is actually what I did there. There are two different things. On the one hand, it's accidental, if you like, pure, unplanned. On the other hand, there is, to some extent, an intuitive element in it. I mean, I think I am, in some respects, in my choice of interests, there's a good deal of intuition in it rather than planning, which may actually explain why I've managed, with luck, to hit on a number of, so to speak, hit the right moment. You see, I mean, the primitive rebels business, for instance, lots of people were working their way in that way. But when this book came out, it actually hit the right moment. And somewhat to my surprise, it had quite a lot of influence, not so much in this country, but I mean in the social science in America, let alone the students, you know. And such phrases like social banditry and so on, which became, you know, it doesn't mean that it was right, but the idea somehow or other was in the air, and by the intuition made me kind of get around to doing it just about that time. Another example is the 17th century crisis, huh? Which began as a sort of, well, essentially a problem that I ran into when I was doing European history lectures. It didn't seem very satisfactory. But having talked to a lot of people, the French and other people, I sort of felt now this got to be thought about and got it published. And again, this had surprisingly wide and lasting effect. It isn't dead yet because, I mean, only 2 or 3 issues ago, the American Historical Review had a review, a return to the 17th century crisis, you see. Again, the phrase was mine, actually, so far as I'm aware, even though the thing wasn't mine. I mean, it's implicit in Brodel, I suppose, or certainly in some other French people that I know. Invention of position is a similar thing. Something I sort of vaguely thought around, but at a certain stage people took it up. Nationalism is, again, I mean, you know, I wasn't the only man by any means to do that in the 1980s, but you know, it's that time, you know. I mean, it happened that I got to do these Belfast lectures, you know. And so what subject does one pick? One goes to Belfast lecture, one picks nationalism, and that's the way it goes. So, that's been really my main contribution, I think. Partly pushing ideas, or at least pioneering ideas, and partly working out syntheses. And synthesis, again, is not mine, but inspired by all sorts of people, but essentially Marx. Without Marx, I wouldn't have, you know, thought of it, doing it that way, or indeed possibly succeeding in doing it that way.
Can I mean, there are many things I'd like to follow up there, but you mentioned the webs, and I was very influenced by my apprenticeship and the appendix-on method, and one fact, one card, and so on. So I wondered how exactly you work. I mean, how do you research? Do you have card indexes? And how do you write?
I did a bit of card indexing, not really an awful lot. I used to work mostly with notebooks, which would then be indexed to some extent, so I could find back what I'd done again. Relying to some extent on having good memory, which unfortunately is now no longer the case. How do I write?
Do you write on a typewriter, or do you handwrite, or...?
No, I wrote on the typewriter really almost from the word go, 20 years or so, on a computer.
Do you revise a lot, or do you just more or less write it down in the first draft? It's fairly clean.
No, it's not clean, because I mean, I keep... It varies a lot, but no, I mean, one's got to revise, but the trouble is it's too easy to revise on a computer. Revise and re-edit. Mostly I've been lucky enough that my editors haven't really interfered too much, so they haven't interfered in my text. On the other hand, the autobiography, where I had Stuart Prophet of Alan Lane, who was an absolute prince among editors, he read it and he was very helpful, and because I had to cut that down very severely.
Mm. Do you enjoy writing?
Yes, if it goes well.
Do you write? I mean, what? I know that music has been important in your life. Does it play any part at all? Some people are inspired by music, or write to music, or listen to music first and then write. Is
No.
there?
No, I would have said it probably gets in the way. It's a very personal business. I mean, my friend Chuck Tilley, a sociologist, wrote and worked to persistent, constant music. I couldn't possibly do that. I have to stop and listen, I think. Well, I like writing. I mean, I try, and obviously one of the things I try and specifically to write in a communicable fashion. I mean, the basic test which one's doing as a lifetime of teaching, particularly teaching people who spend most of their day working and are therefore not particularly lively, is you've got to keep them awake. Huh? The test, my old test is always, can you keep them awake in the 8 to 9 lecture at night after they've done this? And the same thing goes for the writing. So, I mean, to this extent, having had some journalistic experience is useful, even though I'm not a natural journalist.
This was the journalism of writing about jazz, or other things as well?
Anything. I mean, ever since I was on Granter in Cambridge, I edited it at one time, yes. I've been, writing bits and pieces sometimes. But the idea of writing to length and to deadline, but particularly writing to length, has been very useful,
I was wondering, it's a bit different. I've asked a lot of scientists who have a moment when they see a relation or something very clearly, about those, in the cliche, eureka moments. I was wondering whether you have your best moments away from your writing, or walking, or in the, listening to music, or in the bath, or whatever, or whether it's you work it out when you are actually writing.
Mostly when I'm writing, I mean, I sometimes think about what I'm going to write. If at all, probably walking, not in the bath. Probably talking to people. This is one of the big problems. You talk to people, in a sense, you want to be very careful to acknowledge what you get, and for practical purposes it's not easy, sometimes impossible. I mean, it's easy enough if, for instance, I acquire some stuff, some information that I didn't know, say from a student. Say a student from some remote part of the world who tells me about things I didn't know.
Mm.
It's easy enough to say, well, now this is a point made to me by, Mr. Jokic or whatever it is. But it does so much of the thing depends on interchanges, possibly interchanges of the past, that one's always afraid, that one, because after all, if you like, one's priority or at least one's own right to one's own ideas is a fairly important thing in our trade.
Mm.
But I don't think I've been accused of copying too much.
That relates to your teaching. As you mentioned, you learn a lot from your students and from teaching. Do you enjoy supervising and certainly lecturing?
Lecturing I used to be very good at. I'm not so sure about supervising. I've got a feeling, as far as students are concerned, they might or might not get a lot from hearing me talk, and developing ideas and things like that in front of them. But I don't think I've been particularly good at actually getting them to do it themselves. When I've supervised, say, PhDs and so on, I obviously sometimes give them ideas, but I find that a lot of the time I have to give them technical advice saying, now look here, you've got to, how to do it, how to make certain that you do something that you can do within 3 years, that kind of stuff, which is not, which is pedagogic but not an intellectual contribution. Difficult to tell, but I certainly used to enjoy, and I still enjoy to some extent, I enjoy talking.
Yes.
To people.
Perhaps we ought to come back to the chronology a bit. During the war, you were obviously called up. Were you in England all the time?
Yes, all the time.
Yeah.
They wouldn't let me out, you see. And I suspect that I had an MI5
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I suspect I already had an MI5 file, although my attempts to get at my MI5 file have been total failure. But there has been one, but the question is when it started. And certainly it was already there, in my view, during the war. But it was there before the war because I was a very prominent Communist Party person in Cambridge. So
they wouldn't let you out of the country, but they did let you into the arms.
The official line is, it would have done, I could have gone only by a bureaucratic sort of mix-up, as happened, for instance, with James Klugman, who the security people didn't want to let out of the country, but for some reason or other, he was already on the troop ship going somewhere else, and they couldn't get him back.
And then after the war, we're skipping on, but I don't want to keep you too long. But after the war, you came back to Birkbeck. or did you come back to
No,
Cambridge?
I came back. I mean, I had no connection to Birkbeck.
You came back to Cambridge.
I came back to Cambridge.
Mm.
I mean, I came back to Cambridge because in early 1946, having had a really boring and unnecessary war, or which of course I proved naturally, I was supposed to be sent, of all things, to Palestine, or something like that. And I figured it was too bloody complicated to send a Jewish communist at that stage to Palestine in 1946 or thereabouts. So I wrote to King's and said, you know, could you say, because I had this studentship, can you get me back? And they got me back. So I started doing what was then going to be a fellowship dissertation, and but within a year I got this job at Birkbeck, and stuck there basically. Although when my first marriage broke up, I moved back to Cambridge, where I had a fellowship at that time for a few years.
Mm. Who were the people at Cambridge when you went back for those few years? By that time, Christopher was quite getting on, I suppose, a bit.
Well, there were one or two people. I mean,
was Edmund Leach there by that time? Maya Fortes?
Maya was, yes, certainly. Jack Gallagher was back in Trinity at that time, and one or two other people. Boston, of course. But my dealings were really mostly with the economists, because I supervised and examined economic history for the economic strikers for a few years there. I didn't get a job, but so I had more contact then with you know, Nicky Caldor and Morris and Sarafa and Joan Robinson and Richard Kahn and the younger people, you know, Harry Johnson and all these people.
Seems surprising you didn't get a job either the first time or the second time, so to speak. I mean, you don't think that...
Politics.
Yes, I was going to say.
Yes, it was politics.
I mean, was it the politics of communism or the politics of Judaism? Or
no, I don't think Judaism comes into it, no. To the best of my knowledge, I've never felt that I had any kind of discrimination as a Jew. No, I think it was politics. It was also partly, I think, yes, I mean, maybe local politics, because there was this curious political division within the Cambridge economics faculty. Whatever it is, it was lucky for me that I got the job, because the cut-off point for Reds during the Cold War was, roughly speaking, May 48, the Berlin airlift. If you got a job before then, an academic job before then, you were okay. You couldn't expect to get much promotion for about 10 years or so, but you were okay. If you weren't, you had enormous problems. Best of my knowledge, hardly any known communists got academic jobs in those 10 years. Well, you could say Edward Thompson, but that was in the adult education part of Leeds, which isn't quite the same thing. But I think the communism part in Cambridge. Yes, well, there were at least 3, possibly 4 jobs in the economics faculty which I was in, including, of which 2 were clearly inferior. The one who I thought was a reasonable appointment over me was Ken Berrell, who was a friend of mine, and we remained very good friends. Later on, he offered to give me the same job after the change within the faculty, and I said, it's a bit late now. And then eventually I was in for the chair, which again, David Jocelyn got. But, you know, the curious business is that institutionally in England, the Cold War was present. But the curious thing is that, as far as I'm aware, it hardly impinged on the actual intellectual field of history. I mean, whether people got a reputation, both in this country or elsewhere, not merely among people that sympathized with them, but in general, you know, in the field, I don't think that was at all affected by the Cold War.
Let's, in the last 5 minutes, what I would like to ask you, which I ask many people, is, well, 2 questions. One is the relationship between your political life and your historical life, because that seems to be where Marxism joins together 2 parts of your life in a way which made it meaningful. I mean, which would you consider your more important aspect of your life, as a historian or as a political commentator and journalist?
Well, as a historian, although as it so happened, as a committed historian, I mean a politically, and one that is in quite a large number of places regarded as were a politically committed historian. I mean, my actual political activities as such are of no particular moment. The history books have actually been quite, I won't say influential, but symptomatic. I've noticed, for instance, that you can very often test the change in the political atmosphere of particular countries by the extent to which, or the moment at which people start translating my books. In Spain, this began to happen in the 1960s, later 1960s, as Francoism was wound down, see, which is at the time when it's perfectly clear the great bulk of university people, students, were passionately opposed, and it proved to be possible to publish the works of people who weren't actually called Marx or Lenin. In Brazil, the real testing point came in the early 70s, which is just about when the generals began to become, the generals' dictatorship began to be slightly liberalized, or the tension. I discovered by sheer chance, for instance, that in Korea, when I came to Korea in the late 80s, they already had about 5, they pirated 5 of my titles. But this was just about, I was just about there at the moment where it was going over from dictatorship over towards the, you know, the end of the thing. The same thing must have happened in Taiwan, but I don't know, I've never been there. In Turkey, for instance, it's quite clear that since the 1990s, this has been happening. Now, you see, to this extent, in 1 or 2 places, I don't know, because in some countries, like for instance Argentina, until they actually published an enormous amount of this stuff was done by those pirated Xeroxing and stuff like that. But for a lot of these, now this had 2 effects. Partly the time, but partly also that the people that then became radicalized, the young student generation, would eventually become the editors, the publishers, the ministers, the things. So to that extent, you see, in that way, therefore, books like mine had some kind of impact. More in some countries than others. Dramatically so in Brazil, which is for some reason my best market. So incredible, and become part of whatever it is, the official textbooks for the diplomatic academy as well as for all the other things like that. So, but they did so largely because in fact they were readable. And I think that's the importance, you see, the importance of trying to walk the tightrope between, on the one hand, remaining or being acceptable to one's colleagues within the field, and at the same time understandable to that ideal type, you know, the educated citizen. The non-educated citizen, I mean, below that kind of level, I don't think I've known how to talk to much or had much effect on. That effect, I think, is easy. The actual, my effect on the within the field is much harder to test, and I don't think I'm the person to estimate that.
We'll leave it to posterity. And I think perhaps at that point, Eric, we should, sadly, but these conversations can go on forever. So thank you very much indeed for
Well,
lovely.
Thank you.